All right, welcome back. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today, Kaiser Kuo. How are you doing?
Good, man. How are you?
Well, I am excellent.
Yeah.
We haven't talked in a while. We now both have podcasts. Kaiser is the founder and host of the Sinica podcast.
That's right.
Pretty wound up in things having to do with the internet in China, has been, among other things, the director of international communications at Baidu, digital strategy for Ogilvy Mather China. Had a writing, editing portion of the career, the bureau chief of the Red Herring in China, and, as I recall, a member of the Tang Dynasty Mandarin heavy metal band.
That's right, Tang Dynasty.
Did I get that all right?
You're a guitar player too, though, right?
What's that?
You're something of a guitar player yourself.
Yeah, I play guitar. I don't know if I would perform for anybody if there was a demand for people to play country blues. But so I'm glad we have a chance to talk here. I reached out as this sort of COVID. I guess you have to kind of identify which podcast this is now. Is this kind of because I have some in the can that are sort of pre-COVID and they're very odd, where people aren't talking about the virus.
Yeah.
But I'd love to start the Sinica podcast. I just started listening to it. It's fantastic. But what is the story behind it? What's the idea there?
You know, this very afternoon we just celebrated our 10th anniversary. We did a nearly 2 hour long podcast. Yeah, so we got started in April of 2010. My friend Jeremy Goldhorn and I had both been kicking around China for an awfully long time. By then, he had been there for getting on 15 years, and I'd been there for nearly the same. And one night, this was 2010, we were just sort of saying, hey, what podcasts do you listen to, as we were drinking a beer or something, and he rattled off his favorites. I think it was, This American Life and Radiolab, like everyone else in the damned world at the time. And I can't remember who it was that asked, what about podcasts that relate to China in any way? And, neither of us knew of any. There weren't any.
Right.
I think there were a couple of other people having that same conversation, because 2010 was the year that two of my other favorite China podcasts got launched. The China in Africa podcast by Eric Olander, which is now part of our network, and also the China History podcast by Laszlo Montgomery. So I think it was in the air. And 2010, of course, was the year when it suddenly started becoming really easy to get to podcasts from your smartphone. The iPhone was out. Then the podcast app didn't come natively, but there were podcast apps that you could put on the phone. So
right.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, so it was just a labor of love for the first 6 years, and just something we did, not sporadically. We were pretty faithful about getting it out most weeks, but it wasn't something that we were doing professionally.
Yeah, and now it's an entire network. Is that right? It's a whole business?
Yeah, there are 10 shows in it, and they cover everything from issues pertaining to women in China, women, in and around China issues at the top of their professional career. We've got shows on China and Africa, as I said. We've got a really great show on technology in China called Tech Buzz China. Check that one out. I think your listeners in particular would be interested in that. And a whole bunch of other ones, yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, congratulations.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, I thought it'd be a good time to connect, as our industry, the tech industry, and the whole planet sort of affected by COVID. Our industry affected in a kind of interesting way. Some companies doing terribly because they can't raise money, or they can't, people can't ride scooters, and some companies like Zoom or the delivery companies actually going in the opposite direction.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's interesting. As I was preparing for this, I listened to an earlier Sinica podcast from February, so not that long ago, about 6 weeks ago, talking about the emergence of the coronavirus. I think at this point it was still in China.
Right.
It's so funny to listen to a podcast from 6 weeks ago.
Right.
At this point,
another time.
Another time. The main topic was sort of about the possibility of a virus lab in Wuhan. And whether it was from Wuhan or not exactly,
right,
was kind of the topic.
That was, it was one of the things that we touched on. I think that's still a possibility. The guest was a guy who is a public health expert. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. His name is Dr. Yanzhong Huang. And he also teaches at the School of Diplomacy at Seton Hall University. And so he's really well placed to talk about both COVID-19 as a public health issue and also as a political issue. He did touch on that. I don't think we spent more than 5 minutes talking about the possibility of a leak from a lab. And I mean, this is not to suggest that it was a man-made virus, but I think this is pretty well established. There is a lab. It's in Wuhan. It's about 300 meters from the infamous wet market, where we'll talk about that word wet market in a bit if you want to. But
Yes.
he suggested that it's possible that place, we're very sure it does collect a lot of viruses, including coronaviruses, including bat-borne coronaviruses from the southern part of China. Specifically, there's the horseshoe bat, or the horseshoe crab bat. I can't remember what it's called, but that seems to have been the original host for this particular virus, for SARS-CoV-2.
Right. And so I wanted to get your sense. Something I've been struck by in your writings is sort of the, I don't know if the word is violence, but the sort of anti-negative sentiment toward either China or Chinese people. I feel like in my bubble, and literally it's a bubble, staying at home and kind of seeing what's on TV, that I'm not seeing it covered in the press as much as I imagine it's going on. I want to get a sense of sort of what the scope is of the sort of anti-China or Chinese sentiment you're seeing, sort of how it manifests itself.
Right. It's on two levels, of course. There is at the level of politicians and pundits, and this whole sort of move to foist more and more of the blame for the entire outbreak, including calls in not only in the U.S. Senate but also in the U.K. Parliament for China to pay some sort of a reparations for having let this slip the leash, and for the early mistakes that China made, some of which China has been fairly upfront about. For example, the suppression of the so-called whistleblower Li Wenliang, the ophthalmologist who wrote about a SARS-like virus, which he actually thought was SARS, to a few of his colleagues privately, and was reprimanded for it. Of course, he later died, and it was tragic. They've made him actually a martyr of this now. Officially, he's been named and given some sort of posthumous honors. But that's beside the point. So there's at that level.
Right.
But if we imagine for a moment that talk of that nature, especially coming from the presidency itself, when the president himself started using words like Chinese virus and really trying to hold China's feet to the fire for this, naturally, and look, this is a country where after not just September 11th, but after San Bernardino, turbaned Sikhs were gunned down in the streets of American cities because they looked vaguely Muslim. Not that it would have been justified to gun them down if they indeed were Muslims, but this you see this translate. You see shootings in mosques. You see shootings in synagogues. You see shootings in Walmarts, even, where there are Mexican Americans, because of things that come from, because of the hatred that emanates from the Oval Office. And it's no different in this case. So far, thank God, nobody's actually been shot. But there have been stabbings. There have been many, many assaults. There have been, the last time I looked, there were over 650 of them since Trump started using the word Chinese virus. Fortunately, he has stopped.
Was there a moment where this sort of replaced for him? He had the kind of anti-immigrant Mexico thing, but we're not sure the wall got built or whatever happened to the wall. Was this, aside from the stock market, was this just an obvious one for him? Like, hey, there's another group I can just target and blame and go after.
I think what would have been surprising if he hadn't done that, if he hadn't started whipping up xenophobia. It's not been surprising at all that he's done this. China was already being blamed for all manner of woes, whether they were economic, well, primarily economic, but also, about intellectual property theft, about all sorts of other things. And, there's definitely something to some of these issues. There is no question that because of globalization, which is, basically code for China and China's rise, there has been economic dislocation in the United States, and so it's not surprising. No, we have been in a period where U.S.-China relations are already at a low ebb, at a nadir, and that's been for quite some time, really since 2017, right, when he really launched the trade war in earnest. And so it's not at all surprising that he should have chosen Beijing as a scapegoat, especially since the virus does geographically seem to have originated in China.
Right. It's interesting. I'm trying to recreate in the last 6 weeks have been such a sort of strange trip from like, oh, there's this, of 10 news stories, one of them is this place called Wuhan and something going on. And then Italy to like, everybody, almost everybody in America being kind of locked at home, wondering what the world's going to be like. But as I recall, like, what did China do that was wrong? I mean, it seems like there was a virus. At some point, they announced it. They underplayed it, I guess, but they also shut down an entire city, right, which we at the time thought was pretty draconian. So the idea that they didn't do anything doesn't seem precisely right. Like, what did they do? I mean, of course, they should have found the first guy, fixed him, put him in a bubble, but okay, they didn't get that.
Right. Obviously, so, there's a window in which it's not clear at all whether there is human-to-human transmissibility. I think that there was probably too long of a lag between the moment when healthcare workers were already starting to be symptomatic, at which point human-to-human transmissibility is obvious. But again, now, I mean, I don't mean to be making excuses for them, but in such circumstances, it's possible to conclude that maybe it was because the viral load for healthcare workers was so high. It's because the level of contact between healthcare workers and the sick was not normal. It's not clear. So I think that by the end of December, human-to-human transmissibility was fairly well established, and it wasn't until December 31st that they actually informed the WHO about this. And now you can look at that two ways. You can look at you can say, look, they seem to have known about this by December 17th or thereabout, and yet they waited until the 31st to tell the WHO. That's a full 2 weeks. Yeah, those 2 weeks, I'm willing to say, that's a problematic couple of weeks, but that does not explain our lengthy inaction. When Donald Trump was told about this on January 3rd, I mean, it's pretty hard to, from that point forward, lay any blame at China's feet, or at least for me.
Right. Well, and I also, like, what would the theory be? I mean, so there's a virus outbreak, somebody starts talking about it. The leaders of China, what the theory would be that they would cover it up, nobody would find out about it, and then they would squash it and no one would ever know.
I don't think that was what was
like, I don't get what the
right. I think that like any government, they're going to try to weigh and ultimately have to make a bet on pandemic versus panic, right? Is the pathogen worse or is the panic going to be worse? You don't want to, I think that calculus will have changed now. I think everyone will err on the side of over caution going forward. But look, China isn't the only country to have sort of looked at the recent H1N1 outbreak and looked at SARS and concluded that it may not be as bad as we think. That was a mistake. It's clearly a mistake. This was much worse than they had imagined. But I think that we can put ourselves in the shoes of Wuhan municipal health authorities or even of Beijing and think that still there was a calculation to be made. I happen to think they bet very, very badly, and obviously they bet wrong, but I think that was what was going through their head. Not that they were going to squelch the entire thing, but they were just not going to induce panic at an unnecessary moment. You also have to remember when this was happening, that this was on the eve of Chinese New Year holiday. And that's another thing that they did terribly wrong, is they did not stop large scale gatherings in Wuhan during a very critical moment. In fact, there were enormous gatherings of people that were, to commemorate the Chinese New Year, the approaching Chinese New Year, and that was a mistake.
Yeah, and I don't mean to be sympathetic, but there is the concept that if you had said that to somebody in the U.S. 2 months ago, that we're canceling a sporting event or asking you not to gather, that would just seem insane.
Right.
So the fact that they didn't cancel a major holiday, then they should have, of course. But it doesn't seem completely as insane as we probably now describe it today.
Right. We can't take what we know now and apply it retroactively. We have to look at what they knew then. Right. Precisely.
Yeah. And then as it came, how do you think the coverage here, I'm trying to recreate this when everyone's like, oh, Donald Trump should have done this and should have done that. And I'm trying to recall, of course, he should have gotten active on day one, but when he canceled the flights to China, I can't remember what my friends' reactions were. Were we all saying, like, you're not doing enough, you need to cancel all flights?
No. That's
or were people saying, yeah.
They were saying, oh, good, yeah, no, good, cancel the flights. I think there were some that were saying that. There were others, and I think I would have to include myself in this and say, who would have said the WHO is not recommending that. This is overreacting. I have to eat crow on that. I mean, I was wrong. That's maybe the one thing that Trump did right, was cancel the flights, and the airlines did right. I think that was, in hindsight, a very good move. What we knew then, though, was that the WHO had, by that point, already declared it a public health emergency of international concern, but were very clear that closing borders, canceling flights was not an appropriate action at that moment. They were dead wrong, but that's what they said, and I can't be one of those people who decries the way that so many Americans and so many others, in the sort of populist camp, are constantly, beating up on expertise and rejecting scientific knowledge, and at the same time say, well, I know better than the WHO. So, no, I wasn't. Right.
Yeah, as I recall, the number of Facebook posts at the time, that the non-aging well Facebook posts, I think there were a lot of it was a lot of why we're different from China, why we're different from Italy. It seems like Italy's the one where we probably should have said, hey,
we're not so different.
We're not that different. Half of New York, that's came from Italy, and it's a kind of, at that point, what was it? The press coverage, or is it just it's not in the human ability to imagine something that extreme?
That's such a good question. I mean, and that is the question for me. I mean, that's really what maybe I've thought about the most. Why did we just fail to act with alacrity when this was clearly just coming down the pipeline? I look at a couple of factors in that. On the one hand, look, the global South is just sort of invisible to Americans and to people in developed countries in Europe. Again, this is before Italy, right? But look, we had been writing about this. Journalists had been writing about this since quite early in January, right? There were a number of stories. We were very well aware of it. We watched still, even after they locked down a city of 11 million people and then a province of 60 million people, and still we thought, no, that's something that happens there. It doesn't happen to us.
How do we think that? That's the part. Do we just think Wuhan is so different, or the people there are so different?
Yeah, so I think that part of the reason is this, and I don't mean to shit on American journalists who I think have done a very fine job in so many ways in covering this. Even in China, and especially in China, there was a lot of extraordinarily brave reporting. People who went to Wuhan, who flew right into the center of the storm, and wrote really compassionate stories about what was happening there. But a lot of these people, and I mean, it makes sense that they would have been, they're trained primarily as political reporters. China is primarily a political story for us. And so what they tended to focus on was the role of regime type in determining why this went wrong. What happened there was all about the politics. So whether they were talking about the cover-ups or the inaction or the kind of Byzantine bureaucratic apparatus, or whether they were talking about the authoritarian Chinese Communist Party's state mobilizational capacity in treating this. It was mostly talking about regime type, right?
Right.
And so I think it lulled a lot of people who are watching into subconsciously into a sense of false security that we are a liberal, democratic, plural, open state, and therefore not of that regime type, and therefore not really susceptible.
Right. So, and how has the story now unfolded in China? They once they got going and locked everything down, or however far ahead they are. How has they reopened, or
So
what is the state of the state?
yeah, it's there have been reopenings. A lot of, I mean, look, I can't necessarily fault Chinese people or their government representatives from wanting to have taken a little bit of a victory lap, from kind of indulging a bit of Schadenfreude. I mean, after all, they sat there for months as the rest of the world looked on, as a spectator, as a largely unsympathetic spectator. Maybe they were even cheering for the virus. I mean, anyway, look,
Right.
we humans tend to remember the slights, and we don't tend to remember the acts of compassion or the benevolence. We remember the criticisms and the insults and the injuries. And that's how China feels, that basically you shit on us. You didn't lift a finger to help us. That's not true, of course, but that's how it's been played. And there is a very natural level of resentment that's resulted from that. So there's been some of that. I don't think that everything is back to normal. I think that the reports of the numbers of factories that have reopened are probably factually correct in the strictest sense, but they're not running 3 shifts. They're not running all of their production lines. Not everyone is back to work. They're not, operating at full capacity. There is, I mean, if you look just anecdotally at the traffic or anything, it's not what it was prior
Right.
to December, right? It's still, I think if that is a sort of a good proxy measure of it, it hasn't completely bounced back. But is it on the way toward recovery? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you travel around in China, still entering any kind of a residential compound, you are still screened. You have your temperature taken. People are still wearing personal protective equipment as they do this. There is, you're tracked also. Everyone has an app, right? Everyone has, and you're given either a green or a red based on
Right.
what they know of where you've been, who you're in contact with, and your own sort of, I don't know what else factors into that, but that sounds Orwellian. But interestingly, I was looking at a poll going around on Twitter today by one of the American scientists who really blew the whistle on this thing in the very beginning. And he was asking about, how Americans would react if there were such an app and they were asked to use it. And
Right.
the overwhelming majority said they would not hesitate. They would want to use that kind of a sort of, all clear passport,
Right.
smartphone app to say who is free to move around and who isn't.
It's interesting. Yeah, the my take on it, like as an American, isn't that the app would be a problem. It's that if there was a mistake,
Right.
that would be the problem. Like if you were fine and it was stuck on red, and there was no help desk.
Yeah, we can assume there would be mistakes, though. I mean, there's
Right,
always
of course.
mistakes, and so yeah, that's absolutely the case.
So, what do you think this will bode now? Relations with China, but just the kind of supply chain thing. Is everyone really going to move their supply chains to the United States, or is it
Of course,
business is business, and we're going to keep the cheap China labor and the quality products coming into Walmart?
yeah, it's really strange. I feel like we now kind of have a foretaste, not just a foretaste, but it's really a full blown preview of what so-called decoupling would look like, right? If supply chains really are just completely reduced to nothing. We have now a view of what what would happen to not just global trade but also travel. What would happen to educational exchange and it's pretty goddamn grim. I mean, it's pretty awful.
Yeah.
I think when everything is tallied up, we're going to realize just how painful decoupling really would be. Now, that will, I think, convince some people that that's just something we're going to have to live with, and we'll keep going on with it. They're going to be so insistent still on cutting off the nose to spite the face, just because they just hate China so much.
Right.
But there will be, I think, a lot of other people who will be quite sensible about this and realize, whoa, we have to realize that if we want to reduce our dependence on Chinese supply chains, that's going to happen gradually and over time. We're not going to be able to reproduce, these enormous, very sophisticated supply chains, the entire value chain really, in the United States overnight. I mean, Foxconn cannot be recreated in Wisconsin or in South Carolina tomorrow.
Right.
It just can't happen.
Yeah. And so what is China's culpability in this? Going back, I don't, the 2-week delay, okay, lay it up against our 2-month delay, how you can argue about it.
Right.
But this kind of interface, the wet market thing where it came from, and
let's
kind
talk
of what
about
that is
wet
and
markets.
This is a weird term.
Yeah, so a wet market for most of the world, it functions as what a supermarket is. Most markets that you go and buy things from, I mean, they're not packaged goods. They're not. It's you buy fish from a guy with a bunch of fish lying on ice in front of him in a bucket or whatever. You buy. I mean, that's what a wet market is. Not, it's the rare wet market that will trade in anything but animals like chickens, duck, geese, maybe. Pork, mutton, and beef, right? I mean,
Right.
almost you're not going to find, bizarre, rare serpents and pangolins and bats.
Right.
I mean, it's extraordinarily rare.
Right.
And so somehow wet market has become synonymous in English usage just in the last couple of months with trade in rare animal species. These are not perfectly overlapping phenomena. So I'm always worried about the way that the word wet market is used because wet markets are where most people in the world buy their groceries. So that said, yeah, of course. I mean, there's just very little question that it is not a good practice, and China has been pretty upfront about this. Is enforcement perfect? Absolutely not. I think that it will be much better going forward. But when you see articles written just in horror that China has reopened its wet markets, what the hell? I mean, that does not mean that bat is back on the menu, okay? I mean,
Right. So the government wants the bats out.
and not just the bats. They want the civet cats out. They want the pangolins out. They want, everything that basically bush meat, as it's called. Nothing that isn't just basically factory produced.
Right. Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah. So we got that going for us. What other impacts aren't we thinking about? Like trade, but like climate change.
Yes.
Like,
Okay. That's a very good one. Look, I mean, I very recently interviewed somebody who was heading the Natural Resources Defense Council operation in China for a very long time, and she's just put out a book about China's pretty impressive accomplishments in reducing the costs of renewable energy to the point where 2/3 of the people in the world today live in a country where renewable energy from wind and from solar especially, is cheaper now than energy from fossil fuels. So I mean, this is all China's doing. This is all because of China's enormous scale, because of they are able to enjoy significant economies of scale. It's just blindingly obvious to me that these two economies, the world's two biggest carbon emitters, now both on a per capita basis and on an absolute basis, need to cooperate to head off this slow motion pandemic that we're seeing, the slow motion disaster. I think anyone right now in this day and age who is still calling for decoupling is criminally irresponsible.
Yeah, insane. And what is the path forward for getting along with China? I mean, I think a lot of business people, I'm sure the head of Apple doesn't want to decouple with China.
Right.
But what is the kind of path forward to be like, all right, let's get past this pandemic and have a system in place to avoid it, and we can spend some money on it because apparently it's a pretty big problem when it happens.
So I worry about this because I mean, to me, the obvious the easiest solution to this, or maybe the most practicable solution, is to get out and vote and get rid of fuckface von Clownstick.
Right.
And
Yeah.
if once he's gone and all the coterie of evil bastards around him, I think if you look at who Joe Biden has advising him on China right now, these are really smart, really sensible, really pragmatic people, and who people who are quite clear-eyed about China. These are not naives. These are not people who think that China is acting out of altruism to do good in the world. No, who understand competition but want to see that competition managed sensibly, to have guardrails to prevent us from careening off the road as we seem to have done. And I mean, these are people who, I mean, I can name some names. I think Jeffrey Prescott, for example. If you look at Jake Sullivan or Ryan Hass, these are all people who would have been in a Clinton administration in the NSC or at State in positions there, and they've basically been honing their arguments now, and I think have armed themselves all the better now in the last 4 years.
Right.
So that's the solution, really, is to put these sensible people back in decision-making positions.
Yeah, it should be. I said Joe Garofoli, who's the senior political writer for the San Francisco Chronicle, on talking about the state of the election, and it's such a very odd election. But it does seem like Joe Biden's at least got it. He's not fighting with Bernie Sanders till the end, and hopefully enough people can just. I mean, I despair of Trump voters ever changing their minds, but hopefully anybody on the fence can kind of say, let's get rid of Donald Trump and we'll worry about the details later.
Right.
Which exact Democrat I want. We'll figure that out like in the next 8 years.
Yeah, I'm really grateful to Senator Sanders. I think that pulling out right now was a patriotic thing to do. I mean, in the best sense.
I think that's right.
It's the right thing to do.
I want to finish up on something kind of related, like technology in China. Like how is that kind of co-evolving over the past couple of years? Zoom had a brief thing that does not seem to be getting a lot of traction, where most of the Zoom engineers, I guess, or a lot of them are in China, and there's some little conspiracy around that. But that doesn't seem to have slowed Zoom down like one bit. But just tech in general in China.
Yeah.
How's our perceptions, or how's that been changing?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about perceptions, because I think that's the key here. There's the realities, of course, when we talk about those as well. I look at the way that we have thought about technology in China and technology innovation in China. And I think there have been a couple of narratives that we've told ourselves about the relation between China's authoritarian politics, or authoritarianism more generally, not just in China, and technology. We used to, until maybe 4 or 5 years ago, be pretty firmly convinced that technology, and especially ICTs, and within that, especially social media, was going to bring about the demise of authoritarianism around the world. This was, sort of the animating idea of, us cheering on the Arab Spring, right? We kept naming these different uprisings, beginning really in, like Moldova and some of the later color revolutions, naming them after some American social media property. It would be the Twitter revolution, or in 2009 after Ahmadinejad's re-election in Tehran, we were calling that the YouTube revolution. Tahrir Square became the Facebook revolution. We were sure we had this, I'd call it the emancipatory narrative, right? This idea that technology had this volition of its own. It wants to be free. And this is sort of a holdover from this earlier kind of techno-utopian era, where we thought the internet kind of floated freely above the concerns of nation states, right? But it wants to be free. That was, of course, something that we were pretty quickly disabused of. And it happened, again, just in the last 4 or 5 years. And what was it? It was, the failure of the Arab Spring states, It was
Right.
the Snowden revelations about the PRISM program that the NSA was running, and it was the 2016 election when we found out about the Russian hacking, about the Russian troll farms in Macedonia, and of course Cambridge Analytica, which we didn't learn about until 2018, but which was a massive blow. And now where are we? We've completely flipped. Now we believe technology to be the handmaiden of authoritarianism, and Exhibit A seems to be China. There's a danger in exaggerating that when it comes to China in what I would call sort of like, a techno-orientalism, like this idea that everything that China does in technology is at heart about abetting, the surveillance state, right? Now, if you ignore that entirely, that's irresponsible too, because there is a lot of truth to that. But we're tending at this point to err on the other side of just over kind of subscribing to that new narrative.
Yep.
That's silly.
Yeah.
There's another narrative that we've told ourselves, and it's about authoritarianism and tech innovation, right? Not that long ago, we thought that, hey, look, China, you were there, we were in China together. Everyone was just completely dismissive of China's ability to innovate, right? For a very long time. When we were working together, the joke was C to C meant copy to China, right?
Right.
And we believed that for a very long time. We were really dismissive of China's ability to innovate. And we all thought that was, again, because of its authoritarian politics, because you couldn't have innovation if there was internet censorship. I mean, I joked about this once, but half seriously, to the Washington Post that asked me, I said, apparently there's a belief that you can't build a smartphone app unless you know the truth of what happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989.
Right.
The problem, of course, with that, well, besides it being completely untrue, is that we underestimated China's actual innovative capability back then. We told ourselves, I mean, look, and it's kind of, it's a bastion of American exceptionalism, this idea that we are innovative because we're free, right? And again, I guess there's a kernel of truth to that. I think there is a lot of innovation because of the atmosphere of sort of unbridled academic inquiry and all that. But it's great. But I don't think that believing that it's a sufficient condition is a very healthy attitude. And Joe Biden, whose praises I was just singing a second ago, he was kind of, singing lead on that. He was going around and making these speeches talking about how, we will always be more innovative than China because China is, a censored internet environment. Right. Anyway, where have we gone with that now? We've completely flipped that narrative too. We're like afraid that China's going to eat our lunch, that it's this, unstoppable tech juggernaut. And I think we are just as wrong now in our overestimation as we were then when we were underestimating it.
Yeah. When do you think you'll be in China again?
I went in October of the last year, and I probably won't be able to get back there until, well, gosh, I mean, I have no idea. I don't think my visa is any longer valid. I think they've just, so I don't think it'll be for at least another, 8 to 10 months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just crazy.
Yeah.
Well, this has been fantastic.
Can't thank you, man.
I'm really glad you did this. And people can find you. I normally ask people, but I know they can check out the Sinica podcast.
Yes, please. Check it out.
All right. Thanks so much. My guest has been Kaiser Kuo. This is the Something About Your podcast. Talk to you next time.